Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming to this very interesting topic. I'm a physician by training. I got my medical diploma here at Szeged in 1987, and I work in the pediatrics department, and I research. I study biochemistry. As interesting as it is, I have friends who study the Bible, the Torah in Los Angeles, and there have been some interesting questions that we discussed during our conversations. One very interesting aspect of the scriptures is that when you look at Genesis, and if you look at the books of Moses, they are actually copied exactly from previous copies. And what is more interesting is once they make a mistake in any of those rows, they burn it. Meaning that every word, every character has a very important meaning in the scriptures. And when I was looking at certain words like green colors and a food chain, or who should eat what in the Genesis, I figured that they must have some kind of biochemical meaning, and this is what we're going to share today. I brought the King James Bible, which is the first translation of the Torah from Hebrew, and I was wondering if we could do an interesting reading that is a biochemist like myself would read the Bible, and as soon as we find some kind of a chemical entity or a biochemical context, let's just look at it from the physician's point of view. So I use the reference where you can find the information on the internet later for your own studies. So as we know, creation starts with creating the heaven and the earth, and the first chemical identity that we can find in the Bible is actually water. We all know that water has an oxygen and 2 hydrogen molecules with the molecular mass of 18 grams per mole. So as a chemical identity, water is what we find in the Bible first. The next thing that we find in the course of creation is light, actually. And if you look at light itself, it's nothing else but taking 2 hydrogens and pushing them together so that they form an isotope of hydrogen, which is called deuterium. And this deuterium, by squeezed with another hydrogen, we see a wavelength, a gamma ray expelled or released from this fusion. A helium isotope is formed, and from there 2 protons or hydrogens are released, and a helium is formed. And this wavelength, this gamma ray, is the light. So in the first day, we actually see something very interesting, that is, from water and from the hydrogens of water to producing deuterium, there is light emission, which is mentioned in the Bible. Now, deuterium is very important because it carries a principle. Deuterium carries a principle of doubling something, meaning that adding a similar or the same mass to the existing being. And if you read the Bible, the 5th book is called Deuteronomy. And we'll find out exactly what it means. But obviously, this principle of doubling, or the principle of repeating something, has a very important meaning in the scriptures. And in fact, this is exactly how light is produced. So if you call how light and water interacts in biological systems, we touch on photosynthesis, which is nothing else but using the energy of light to actually cleave water from hydrogen and oxygen. This is what plants do. Plants actually cleave water and use these hydrogens and release the oxygen. This is how trees, this is how plants, this is how green plants produce oxygen for us. And they actually use the hydrogen for producing organic molecules using carbons and actually produce our body. It's a very long, very complicated chain of biochemical reactions that I'm not going to go into details, but the principle itself, that first water is created, then light is created. Obviously, this calls for the possibility of when, like, a green plant will be created to carry out photosynthesis. And in fact, in the Bible, if we summarize the events in the first day, which is water and light and deuterium production, the next thing that we see is the Creator divides the water from the waters. Now that's really an interesting concept, dividing waters from waters. Why would you, or how would you divide waters for waters? Or once you divided them, what's the difference between water pools, different water pools? Actually, if you look into a living cell, if you look into a mammalian or a plant cell, you're going to see several water pools that are separated by membranes. And those water pools are different in their deuterium content. And I'm going to talk about this in more details. If you look at a plant cell, for example, a green plant cell like this one, or even if you look at a mammalian cell, which has a mitochondria, this is what we call a mitochondria, where the energy production, the citric acid cycle takes place. The cytoplasmic water, which is actually part of the cytoplasm, and the water that is contained in the mitochondria itself, which is produced from oxygen, I'm going to talk about this in more details, are separated by these membranes. And in fact, these water pools are different in their deuterium content. So if you just refer to this one sentence of the Bible separating water from water, in fact, in biology, we see many examples of this principle itself. So in the second day, we have water pools separated from one another. We know in the Bible it's the firmament is heaven. Yet in biology, we can find different water pools separated by membranes, which is mentioned in the Torah or in the Old Testament. Now, if you read the Bible, the first thing that God creates, the first living creature that God creates is grass. And it's breathtaking because actually grass, or in some translations, they call it green herbs, is actually where photosynthesis takes place. So it seems that now, at the second day, we already have everything created necessary to actually start life, or in fact generate a self-supportive biochemical biological system which has actually green chloroplasts or green plants in the form of grass in this case, and then we already have light and we already have water. Now, and I have to admit, I don't read Hebrew yet. I have friends who can in Los Angeles. So on Sabbath day, when I heat up food for them, or when we go into these discussions about the Hebrew Bible or the Hebrew text, I usually ask them what this means exactly, and it's actually grass. It's green herb or grass. The most accurate translation of the Hebrew word in this sentence is grass. And we know grass is the biggest mass on earth as far as green plants go that produce organic material from and using photosynthesis. There are also trees created, and the trees produce fruits using photosynthesis, as we all know. And what's also very interesting is that another concept appears in the Bible after the photosynthesis, and let's just go into that green color because it's going to explain us a lot of very critical understanding of biological systems, biochemical systems, and photosynthesis. If you look at the rainbow, if you look at the sky when it's raining, you see the colors of the rainbow. Interestingly, plants only use two particular colors the blue, which is the highest energy spectrum, and the red, which is the lowest energy spectrum. And if you look at the protein that actually cleaves water into oxygen and hydrogen, you can see that it's called P680. So the protein that cleaves the water uses the least energetic light form. This is why we see the plants green, because the green light is not absorbed in the plants that use photosynthesis. So you actually, what arrives in your eyes is the green color, yet everything else is absorbed during photosynthesis. But actually, one of the proteins, which is called this PS2, uses P680, or the wavelength 680, which is red, the least energetic. And the key to that, to understand why that happens, is that it's called actually the photosystem 2, the protein, is that when water is cleaved, and this is an oxygen, and the hydrogens are actually connected to proteins, and the oxygen is kind of trapped between these two ions, the least energetic light can only cleave oxygen and hydrogen bonds. So it seems that if water carries a deuterium, this low energy light will not able to cleave this. So during photosynthesis, and in that sense, in the Bible, there is a discrimination against chemical bonds which carry deuterium in water, and there's a preference of cleaving oxygen and hydrogen bonds. And this is really interesting and very critical of understanding why green plants actually deplete deuterium and how they deplete deuterium. The key to understand it is practically the strength of this oxygen-hydrogen bond and how it reacts with the red light that is absorbed from sunlight. So in green plants, there's already a deuterium depleting process. And if you look at the Bible and you look at the 5th book, which is called Deuteronomy, it's going to explain a lot of very interesting and critical understanding of why deuterium in biological systems is really not desirable, and why hydrogen is preferred when it comes to biosynthesis and then biological oxidation. So in the 3rd day, we already halfway through creation, but we already have water, we already have light, we already have waters pool separated, we have grass, green plants which are able to perform photosynthesis, and already there's a discrimination against one of the isotopes of hydrogen, which is deuterium. And the next day, or going back to grass, another very important principle appears, and that is the Creator creates with seeds, and those seeds actually yield new plants or new entities of their kind. So this is the this is the genomics, the functional DNA inheritance, biological genomic inheritance, the basic principle of biological inheritance. And it's really interesting because truly in the Bible, in the Torah, everything is created based on its own kind, and it's actually carried in the seed itself. So the Torah contains reference to very important biological principles like photosynthesis, and also very important principles like functional genomics, meaning that everything carries a seed, as they are all created with a seed, has some information embedded in it, which actually carries all its features and characteristics. So not only photosynthesis is completed, but a new principle is introduced, and that is practically genetic inheritance, or if we just stretch it, for example, DNA. But the seed and the nucleus and the genetic inheritance is definitely mentioned in there. Now, the 4th day, the sun, the moon, and the stars are created and are placed on the skies. And the sun is very important because the sun, with the different temperature and core material, the sun is where all the rest of the elements are created or formed for biological life. That includes carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphor, and chloride. So obviously, the sun is not only the source of light by squeezing deuterium, squeezing hydrogens together, but at certain temperature and at certain pressure conditions create other elements. And these other elements are necessary for life. We know that all our organic material contain carbons and oxygen and hydrogen. This makes up 99.9% of all our bodies. And they are actually exchanged for energy and create a very colorful, very potent, life self-supporting biological system where all the elements are actually created as a biochemist. I can identify or I can see those in the first book of Moses in Genesis. Now, probably the Creator knew that all these elements, carbon and oxygen, and their isotopes will not have a major impact in chemical reactions, but hydrogen or deuterium will. Because practically deuterium is twice the mass of hydrogen. And because of this very strong, we call isotope effect, which I'm going to talk in more details a little bit later, is why biological systems cannot tolerate it very well. So as we go further into the story of creation, then we see that the waters now will have fish and life and the birds are created. But there's also another very important new biological phenomenon, and that is moving appears. And we know that actually moving requires energy. So now not only we have the chemical entities that are necessary to form life, but now we're going to have new principles, for example, active movement, which is the characteristic of all creatures that are now coming forth. We know that actually plants don't really have active organs for active movements, but actually the fish and the fowl will have those characteristics. And again, they are all created after their kind. So the genomic principle in creation is again mentioned in the Bible when the fish and when the birds are created. And as you can see, for biological movements, I added, besides the genetic enhancements, DNA, I added ATP. The reason for that is because biological movement or active movement requires the synthesis of ATP, which happens for us to be able to move. Actually, when you go to the gym, what you do is you actually make two proteins kind of become adjacent to one another. And that requires ATP or energy or phosphate. And one is called the actin, the other one is called myosin. And this is very basic in and throughout biology, that biological or active movement or active change of locations actually requires this metabolic component called ATP. And interestingly, ATP is in fact produced in the mitochondria where water is separated, and ATP is produced with the use of oxygen, and water is produced in the meantime from the hydrogens of food, of what we eat, what we consume, what we oxidize. And this ATP, as the basic chemical principle necessary for movement, is what is generated in biological systems, and it's true of fish, the birds, and also the beasts, which are actually all the living creatures, which actually move, like the cattle, which actually move around the earth. And as we go into the more into the story of creation, what you can see then animals are created. They are actually moving. Again, they are created after of their kind. So again, genetic inheritance is imprinted in the texture. And what you can see also is that cattle, which we know is the animal that is really a grass-eating beast, if you will, cattle is created. So it seems that not only photosynthesis, water, light, energy, and movement is created, but now we are getting ready to form some kind of a food chain or some kind of a exchange of energy or feeding based on a food chain in the Bible. So we already actually create something new in its own form. And if you can see that at 6A, when animals or cattle are created, again, they are matched with genetic inheritance and biological energy and ATP synthesis. So now we are ready, or the creator is ready to create man, but actually there is no DNA mentioning in here, which is quite unusual because it seems that man is created in God's image. So obviously genomics has less of a role, but actually values and moral seems to be more important than the genetic inheritance. And the rest of the texture, the rest of the Bible is actually, I would say, practically nothing else but to teach how this looks like, how God looks like. What is the teaching? What God would want us to be like, if you will. And it's very interesting because, as you can see, everything was created based on genetic inheritance, and now this new principle comes in that is moral and values. And, and there's a lot of teaching about this in the Bible, and eventually, if you would say salvation comes to, like, how close we can get to this, actually. How close we can get to the values that God offers throughout its teaching and throughout the history of the religion in various human populations and societies. So I find this very interesting that as a physician and as a biochemist, that in the Bible you can find all the principles that are necessary for a self-supported biological system. But when it comes to man, on top of it, there's a very strong set, very broad set of moral expectations, and there's a very distinct expectation, and that is to look like somebody like God actually created based on that image. So if you look at the rest of the 6-day events, there's something very interesting will be unfolding, and that is God blessed what He created, all living forms, including man, and actually He actually gives dominion over the fish and the fowls and everything that is moving upon the earth. Yet God will specify that all living creatures can eat the herb and the herbs that are being seed, and every tree whichever yield fruits, and we should eat these fruits and herbs. It seems that there is a reference to vegetarian diets, yet if you read further the Bible, you can see that every beast of the earth and every fowl and every creature that moves actually should eat the green herb or the grass. So we go back to the very beginning, which is the grass, which was first created. And it seems like the bottom of all life, the bottom of all life form, the bottom of this food chain, if you will, is actually the green herb. And I don't want to get into details of what happens in the grass, but if you talk to a biologist, if you talk to a chemist, and if you talk to somebody who studies the grass and the grass forms and how actually photosynthesis takes place, and how deuterium discrimination happens in grass, you're going to find several water pools, and you're going to see a plentiful source and resource of chemical material, including drugs, including phytochemicals, including all kinds of nutrients that come from grass or green herb in this translation, but in the Torah it's actually grass. What's also very interesting is that when you look at the texture, it also refers to creep or moving creatures, and also mention that wherein there is life. Now, if you talk to a Hebrew person and you ask him what is there is life, it's actually breathing. So if you look at the original text, it actually means nothing else but breathing. And some translations, some English translations actually spell it out as moving and breathing creatures. So obviously, the oxidation of grass using oxygen through breathing for us to be able to move requires this principle, which you can see here as going from photosynthesis, producing organic material. This is what all living creatures as the bottom of the food chain, this green plant is. This is where all these reactions take place that are described in creation. And then we're gonna oxidize this grass again using oxygen, which we take in through breathing, and produce water, which is low in deuterium depleted water, which we're going to use to build our own body. So eventually, if we go through the events of the first 6 days, we can see how this organic material is built, which is actually oxidizing the citric acid cycle, and we're going to see what oxygen is used for in the system, and that is practically to be able to move around to produce this ATP, and also to be able to function and build our body using the carbons that are released from during this biological oxidation process. That CO2 or that carbon dioxide will be reused by plants, organic materials will be built, and in between there is this deuterium depletion process by producing water from plant organic material that has a different source of hydrogen. So obviously this hydrogen deuterium story is very interesting. The oxygen breathing and the active movement in the Bible is very interesting because it seems like somebody was trying to communicate a self-supportive biological system where all the elements are described in the form of verses, in the form of little algorithms. Yet, if you read it from the texture, from the glasses to the glasses of a biochemist or a physician biochemist, you can find all these very interesting references to biological oxidation and the Krebs cycle. And I like to talk about this topic because many of the reactions of the Krebs cycle was discovered here by Albert Szeged, and he was given the Nobel Prize in 1937 in Szeged. So, and as we read the Bible, it seems like there is a rewind. Moses says that, okay, stop here, Genesis chapter 2, stop here because there's more to explain. I haven't yet given you all the details, because what the Bible says is that in Genesis 2 is that every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, for the Lord had not caused it to rain, so nothing is grown. It seems like the Bible takes us back to the third day and says, okay, hold on for a second, because there's nothing grown. Everything is created, yet nothing is grown yet because there is no rain and there is no human resources yet. Nobody can actually harvest. And this is a very interesting development because I would figure like everything is created, everything is fine, there's water, there's just way of like growing things, but that's not the case because there's no rain yet. And you believe it or not, rain comes not from river, not from flood, but from moist. Moist from the earth has risen, and that water, the face of the earth, that's actually deuterium depletion and actually distillation. So if you want to build a deuterium depleting tower, what happens is deuterium, as it's heavier than light water, as water evaporates from the face of the earth, deuterium is discriminated. So deuterium has a higher boiling point, and it's also heavier. So actually, as high the clouds will get, more negative these numbers will grow, meaning that less deuterium there is in clouds. So the rain that falls from the clouds is actually deuterium depleted water. So it's not only deuterium depletion in grass by discriminating against light, which is using red light for photosynthesis and actually using a wavelength and energy that cannot really break oxygen and deuterium bonds. But the Bible says, let's just go back to second day because in fact I'm going to water stuff. I'm going to water the grass, but it's going to be deuterium depleted water. And that's exactly what is referred to in the Bible or in the Torah if you read it through the glasses of a biochemist. This is a deuterium depleting tower in Budapest. We use this for therapeutic or pharmacological purposes. This is Gábor Somlyai here, who actually built the first such tower in Budapest. So what we do here is exactly what the Bible suggests. We actually boil water in these containers. They go up through the roof, and actually we cool it down. So by repeating this process, just like in the Bible, or just like in Genesis, repeating this process, we can deplete deuterium in water. And we use this water to, for example, to water plants, to give patients food that actually have low deuterium. So actually we do the same, what is in the Bible, described in the Bible, obviously under controlled circumstances. This is very important because some disease processes like autoimmune diseases and cancer seem to be dependent on this deuterium or DNA modifications by deuterium, which I'm not going to go into detail. I'm not going to talk about those specific diseases because that would be a little bit too much of a topic to cover, but those are very interesting medical, clinical applications. So obviously the red low energy light is discriminating against deuterium as far as cleaving water, and actually the heavy water climbs harder in rain into clouds, so there's a higher boiling point for deuterium containing water, which has actually a proton and a neutron. Hydrogen only has one neutron, so it has half of the mass as deuterium does. So obviously there is several layers of deuterium depletion in the Bible, which you can see eventually described something like this is live water that can actually raise, and deuterium and heavy water will stay in the ground, and that's what you can see here, practically just a demonstration of how many deuterium discriminating processes there may be in the Bible. Now, angewandte Chemie, that's
Angewandte
Chemie. Okay, I'm sorry, I apologize. Applied chemistry, is that right?
Yes.
Applied chemistry. So, in August, well, when we are writing this paper, I have a professor colleague from the Johns Hopkins University who happens to be the head of the chemistry department. And he sent me this paper and he said, Dr. Boros, you should look at the hydrogen effect, deuterium effect of this group, because this is from Bochum, Germany. They are German, they're theoretical chemists. I mean, they pretty much know their stuff. And what they described in this paper is exceptional isotopic substitution effect and breakdown of collective proton tunneling in ice due to deuteriation. So you would say in ice, actually where protons have very important bridging functions, seems that between these oxygens, these hydrogen molecules have a very important role in regulating the physical and chemical properties of ice. And let me tell you this experiment. If you watch this hydrogen between these two oxygens, you can see that it has, and all the protons, all the hydrogens in this ice, which is a hydrogen bonding network, they are in a position either closer to the oxygen to the left or closer to the oxygen to the right. It's what we call is tunneling, because these protons in the same time, they do this moving from one place to another. It's like halftime when two football teams actually switch half, when they switch halves. So actually all the players, all the 11 players, we are talking about a soccer game, they either play on this side of the field or actually their goal is on one side of the field or the other. The key to it is they have to move together, because if one player stays on the other field in halftime, that's going to be pretty much the end of the game. So, but that's what happens if we bring one deuterium into the system. So if we replace one hydrogen with a deuterium atom, for example, H1 or hydrogen 1 is replaced with a deuterium, it's going to actually destroy the energy, the constant energy level along which the hydrogens can move from closer and farther from one oxygen atom. So it's enough to build one deuterium into 10 or 15 of these hexagonal ice crystals, which will actually destroy this completely this energy balance in this ice or hydrogen bonding systems. And obviously, there are many examples of this. Ice is, I would say, the most, the easiest to approach system, because hydrogen bonds are formed based on temperature or cooling down the water, and then they can study very easily these energy levels which are necessary to move those hydrogens around in a coordinated fashion. More deuterium we actually built into this system, more energy is required to move the protons, and it's not going to happen in a coordinated form. So one deuterium is enough in about 100 hydrogen atoms to destroy the free movement of protons or hydrogens between two atoms. And the biological meaning of this stopping these proton movements is that actually these protons are also part of DNA, and actually DNA forms these hydrogen bridges, the double helix, you know, they're linked with hydrogen. So you actually, if you load your DNA with deuterium, this proton tunneling and these enzymes which actually repair DNA will not be able to get through this road bump. It's pretty much like when you cut your grass and you bump into this big chunk of grass, it's just going to stop the entire process. And that's true with all hydrogen bonding systems. And actually this is what these German chemists recommend. They say these insights into fundamental aspects of collective proton tunneling not only rationalize recent neutron scattering experiments, but also stimulate investigations into multiple proton transfers in hydrogen bonded networks much beyond ice. And we know DNA, protein-DNA interactions, and fatty acid interactions are all covered in this sentence with far-reaching biological, biochemical consequences. So deuterium makes DNA sticky. Aneuploidy is one of the disease-related patterns in cancer. I'm not going to talk about it, but it seems that in DNA, there's a very critical role of understanding hydrogen and deuterium replacements. Now, and it's just a just to continue on this line, when I asked a friend, like a priest friend, why is it so important that when Adam was brought to life, actually God did breathe in his nose? Obviously, because through the nostrils we can only carry oxygen. So again, when and every word has a meaning in the Bible, meaning that when nostrils, when oxygen, when you actually resuscitate somebody, and you want to actually provide oxygen for their biological oxidation, it's actually through the airway system. And it seems that this is, and in fact, this is how we deliver oxygen to our tissues. So even the Bible, even the Torah refers to oxygen exchange when it comes to starting the first human life. And that's practically referred to as breathing into the nostrils. Again, as a doctor, as a physician, this is how to resuscitate somebody. So actually these make a lot of sense, even though at the first sight they not be as evident. So then it comes the other story, and that's the Garden of Eden, where, as it seems, there's going to be plant and fruit growing business, and obviously there's going to be fruits they should or shouldn't eat. But the more important fact is that it seems that for the Garden of Eden and for the fruit trees, actually the Lord is going to use another irrigation system, and that's actually, it's going to flood it with river. And we know river has no deuterium depletion. So we know river water will have no deuterium depletion. It's not rain, it's not distillation. It's actually flooding and grown plants without actually being able to deplete deuterium. So why don't we oxidize some substrates and find out if it's really true or not? So what we did with the Hungarian Academy of Sciences Geophysical Research Institute is that we actually, with Dr. Forage, we actually oxidized some substrates. So instead of iron, we used copper oxide. And with this copper oxide, we measured in flour, table sugar, cottage cheese, sunflower oil, butter, and pork fat, and we just oxidized them overnight at high temperature at 500 Celsius. So we pretty much did what mitochondria would do, and we actually calculated the deuterium content in many different food products. And we measured this deuterium and hydrogen ratio. And I'm not going to bore you with all the technical details, but this is what we got. Oceanic water is about 155 parts per million deuterium, and this is what we're going to use as a reference range. Water, which we actually distill from cottage cheese, that's the wet content of, for example, cottage cheese, you can see the value is pretty much, it's very close to the deuterium content in water. If you look at flour, which is actually sugar, or you look at table sugar, which come from fruits, you can see that there is a very little drop in deuterium content. So it's consistent with the fact that these sugars and the water content of food has very much similar distribution of deuterium as what you find in water. Now, on the other hand, animals that eat grass and produce their organic material from components of grass, then you're going to see there's a huge drop in deuterium content. You can see there is a 12%, 16, 20.4, and almost 25% decrease in deuterium content when we oxidize pork fat, for example, or butter. So in fact, when you look at the kosher diet, what the Hebrews should eat is actually this deuterium depleting section of the food supply. And it's really, what's really interesting is there's plenty of kosher recommendations about what they should eat, but there's very little about what they should drink. Actually, if you look at the rabbi teaching, rainwater is what Hebrews, or actually this is how Israel, the land of Israel is watered. So all the kosher diet, and actually this is in Deuteronomy. If you open Deuteronomy, the 5th book of Moses, you're going to see nothing but all these instructions of how or what they should eat. And I'm going to go to, for example, this is how egg looks like. The egg has low deuterium when you go to the DNA and it's fat, the egg yolk, the yellow material. But what is more important is that obviously we know there was a flood in between, meaning that Noah had to build an ark, and then the ark had to be like floating for 40 days and so on. But what happened after the rain subsided, and actually Noah went forth and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him of the ark, and every beast and creeping, moving thing was actually coming off the ark. You can see they were all coming their kinds, meaning that genetic inheritance, again, is a very important principle when it comes to repopulating the earth. But what is more important, again, is that after, when actually life starts on earth again, the same food chain applies. The green herb or the grass should be the basic food item that comes at the bottom of the food chain. And this is the first kosher recommendation and law, which is repeated in Deuteronomy many times, and more specified is that, but flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood, shall you not eat. Meaning that the kosher diet does not allow you to eat or drink high deuterium containing body fluids, but only what is coming from herbs and oxidized green plant products. If it's meat or fat, whatever it is, they have to stay away from deuterium. So obviously, the kosher diet is very keen on regulating this hydrogen deuterium content controlled by mitochondria through metabolic water and cytoplasma from water that we drink. And if you look at the non-kosher diet, there's no particular instructions about what we should eat. Obviously, we can also eat pork, but in this section, the kosher diet is what uses the green grass and its products in animal fat products. Now, this is very interesting because if you talk to a kosher person and you ask him which part of the beef is kosher, sirloin steak is not kosher. And that's the best part of the beef, but it doesn't have enough fat. You know the beefsteak tartare? It's actually a sirloin steak, and actually that's not kosher because it only has 5% of fat. So proteins and proteins and DNA and so on is really not, or sugar is really not kosher, yet fat is, which you can oxidize into low deuterium water, is what is kosher. I was surprised because obviously I was doing some research into what is kosher, what not, but it seems that it's a deuterium depleting diet. Now, I was talking about DNA before, and in DNA, between the bases, there's this hydrogen, and it has this free movement. But if there's a deuterium built in here, this free movement stops, all the DNA repair enzymes stop, the DNA start growing, it's going to be aneuploid, and cancer develops. That's what we believe is a very effective way of controlling cancer, keeping deuterium down in DNA. And it's just another scheme of DNA. Now, so obviously when it came to Deuteronomy and Moses told all these laws, deuterium depletion laws to the Jews, Obviously, it's a very close genetic population. Yet, the new covenant calls for teaching by Jesus of the Jewish values, but obviously the genetic pool is going to be expanded because there's no dietary recommendations anymore by Jesus. There's no deuterium depletion processes by Jesus. Actually, we can eat anything we want, and it's going to be a teaching which is set to a very broad genetic pool, which means that the new covenant will have in its teaching form a very different set of rules, the same values, but similar and same values expanded also with Christianity. And obviously I'm not a theologist, I'm not an expert in this field, but from the Bible, if we read it as a physician, I can tell you this much. The most important finding is that when Jesus meets this lady who is a Samaritan lady at the well, and he asks her to give him water. And she says, she actually goes to the well at noon because she's a prostitute. So she doesn't want anybody to see her. Because at noon, because of the high, obviously, temperatures and sunlight, it was not accustomed to go to the wells without dresses. So usually Samaritanians, they went to the well after 6, but this lady had to go to the well at noon because she didn't want her to be seen by anybody. And was not her luckiest day because Jesus was sitting at the well. So, and he asked her for water. And that's exactly what he asked. Will you give me a drink? And the lady asked that, well, you are a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman, so why are we talking? And Jesus says, well, don't worry about it now. I'm coming with a different message. So this is a very simple teaching and referring to the kingdom of God. And the lady says, you know, the truth is you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is very deep. So where can you get this water? How are you going to get to this water? And that's when Jesus says, and that's what the lady adds, you consider yourself bigger than any of our ancestors. And Jesus answers, everyone who drinks from this water that you are going to fetch water from will be thirsty again. But however drinks the water I give you or I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water. Do we produce water? Yes, we do. I just showed you in the mitochondria. That's deuterium depleted water. Again, it's the physician's reading. And that's going to give you eternal life. Obviously, it has a very strong spiritual message, it has a very strong biological message, and it has a very strong cultural message. It's obviously not a Christian teaching, but it's a Christian example of how water and water pools are approached and used in this context. And in fact, we produce our own water with the use of oxygen, obviously, and from food, and actually we have a spring of water in our system. And the lady obviously is very curious about it, and she says, well, sir, if that's the case, then why don't you actually, give me some water? Just give me some water. And interestingly, Jesus has no mention of the water anymore, but what does he ask next? That's shocking, because he says, bring your husband. And what's interesting is that she says, I have no husband. So this is actually a very different cultural, and it's a very different approach to what, like the Jews, who have very strict family traditions and have very strict rules about family life. Now it seems that the same values are offered and the same teaching is offered to somebody who actually had no husband, and in fact, she actually had 5 husbands, and the one that she has now is not even her husband. So obviously, who actually Jesus is talking to, and will give her this promise and this message about the gift of life, the water that is in her, and it promises eternal life, is obviously the footstep and the milestone to the new covenant. So I'm gonna pretty much stop in a few minutes, but I want to ask Dr. Dux, who is the biochemistry professor here in Szeged, and we have been writing about this topic. I want to thank your professor, Dr. Máté Tóth, who organized, and also our friend Gábor, this lecture, and also some of my collaborators in the United States. And if there are any questions, I'm very happy to answer them. Thank you very much.